Hello guys, and welcome to Chapter 8 of this Production Pipeline series tutorial with me, Elder from Lodge Lumiere. Today we're going to be going into Mudbox and we're going to be painting out this landscape. And what I want to discuss for the first few moments of this tutorial is I want to go over a clarification of a few features here in the IPR and a few optimization techniques. So came to my attention from a student that my IPR rendering was a little bit slow, and they mentioned it to the solid angle team. And we came to find out that especially when using the sky shader, there's a calculation table that happens, and it takes a pretty decent amount of time to calculate, along with, of course, the subpolygon displacement and everything else as well. If you want to get a little bit of a faster speed, you can actually, in your Arnold sky, go ahead and use a lower resolution setting for your sky. Right now I have mine set to 1000. In the Arnold documents, it recommends, of course, that you use the highest resolution that your image provides. So in this case, for final render, we use 7070. But for quickly rendering something out, you're going to go ahead and go with something like around 2 to 1000. And that'll be fine for your resolution as you do test renders. Alright. Same thing goes along the lines with textures as well. So if you've got a character that you're doing that's extremely highly detailed and needs, really nice 8K textures on the arms and the face and different things like that to get extremely high levels of detail on that character, you can actually get away with using like 2K textures for production. So oftentimes what I'll do is I'll go into something like Bridge, and I'll take all my 4K, 8K textures, and I'll select them all, just like so. And we can pretend like these are textures. And then I go into Tools, go into Photoshop, go under Image Processor, and that's going to load up Photoshop for us, if it's not already open. And then in Photoshop, what we can do is we can use the Image Processor to go ahead and convert our textures down from whatever their size is to a more reasonable size, and use those temporarily for testing purposes. So we can do a resize to fit, and you probably want to keep the aspect ratio pretty solid here. Unfortunately, there's no real aspect ratio button here, so you're going to kind of have to figure out what your aspect ratio is. Under most typical 3D rendering circumstances, your texture should be square, and I almost always use square textures unless I'm using the textures that are given to me by somebody else. But they're almost always powers of 2, and they're almost always square. So you can go from 4096 down to 2048, or 8192 down to 4096, or whatever have you, and just scale those down, and Photoshop will happily run through there and process all 5 of them out for you really, really fast. And you would have lower res textures that you could use for testing purposes, for IPR rendering, for quicker renders. Depending upon your resolution, if you're doing something like 720, you might not even need that 8K or that 4K, so you might be good to go. Alright, but that's just a few speed up and optimization techniques. So what we can do to go into Mudbox is we could export here from Cinema, and in fact I've already went ahead and I've exported a object. So if you want to do that from Cinema, you would just go ahead and copy the landscape, go ahead and create a new scene, go ahead and paste that in there. Because the Cinema 4D exporter doesn't really have a export selected kind of sort of option to it, so you just export what you want to export out to the new scene. Go ahead and turn off the IPR so we can get a little bit faster feedback here. And then you just export that out as an FBX. And I've got a FBX folder here, and call that Landscape Mudbox. Replace it, and then you go ahead and turn off textures and materials, lights, cameras, splines, pretty much everything. Probably could even turn off the animation stuff too. Just leave that on just for giggles. But, and that would export it out. Only problem I found is for some particular reason with this landscape, it seems like all of the individual UV polygons seem to have gotten split up or something like that. It could be something that happened in Zbrush. That could be something with the export coming out of Maya. But if we were to use this landscape in Mudbox to go ahead and paint, and here we are in Mudbox, we were to go ahead and import this object in. So we'll come in here, come into FBX, we'll go ahead and import this in. And we'll do a zoom in, and because the scale of this scene is so large, we have to kind of sort of zoom in. Our camera's clipping here in Mudbox, so we have to zoom in order to be able to see our landscape here. But if we were to come in and go into our layers and create a new paint layer here, give it a diffuse and call it maybe base. And we can start to paint with just about anything. So come in here into our projection brush and use maybe this stencil here, and it's going to give us this nice kind of sort of stencil to use. And so the stencils with the projection brush are basically projection images. So if you're familiar with something like Mari, this is going to allow you to paint right through onto the model that's underneath. And so as we start to paint this, we're seeing that we're getting like this artifacting. And that's because each individual shell is basically like a separate scene. We can use Q to hide our stencil. We can see that we're getting this really, really exotic artifacting here. Alright, so let's go ahead and create a new scene here. Don't save. And so in this particular case, we're going to go into Maya, and we've saved out our landscape. And I've already set the project to this current landscape project. So we have the UVs that we created for Zbrush, and you know, luckily we saved those. Those are kind of our master UVs. So this is kind of our master asset that has like really good UVs on it as we initially intended. And if we go to our UV texture editor and we select that landscape, we can see all the UVs. And if we were to load the Cinema 4D FBX back here into Maya, we would notice that as we go into shell mode and click on just one of these polygons, only one of them would highlight. Basically every single polygon in the model had its own individual shell, which was really killing Mudbox's capabilities of kind of sort of smoothly being able to paint between everything. But here in Maya, we can see that each one of our shells, or each one of our tiles, basically has a full shell to itself. This is going to give us a much better painting experience. So here in Maya 2015, if we're using Mudbox 2015, we can come in and we can actually send this to Mudbox. And we can go ahead and send it as a new scene. And then come into Mudbox and ta-da, the landscape just pops right up in Mudbox. It also pops in at a pretty decent size. It doesn't pop in with the crazy scale that Cinema 4D's landscape popped in. This is going to probably be a little bit easier to paint. Since the UVs are the same across the board, it's very easy for us to, of course, go back and take the UVs that we painted here, take them into Cinema 4D and use them anyway. So we're not really losing anything by exporting out of Maya, other than, of course, needing to have an extra program on hand to actually paint. So Mudbox is a bit similar to Zbrush. They're slightly different. In Zbrush, you can take a sphere and you basically, with Dynamesh, can turn it into clay and pretty much take a basic sphere or a cube and turn it into a human being, turn it into an alien, turn it into a spaceship, to whatever you want. It's pretty much like if you got a bottle of Play-Doh or a cup of Play-Doh, bucket of Play-Doh, and you just kind of sort of created an intricate sculpture out of it, and then you were able to just use that as a 3D model. That's kind of what you can do in Zbrush. Mudbox works on a kind of sort of classic kind of sort of deal. Before Mudbox Release 4 came out, or ZBrush Release 4 came out, it kind of worked in a similar kind of way, where you would take a base mesh out of something like Cinema 4D, 3ds Max, or Maya, and then you would create the basic asset, create the basic car wheels, the car body, or whatever, and then you would go into something like ZBrush or Mudbox and detail it, add in all that extra high frequency detail and different things like that. Where Mudbox differs, of course, is it's got a very clean alt left, alt middle, and alt right kind of sort of Maya Cinema 4D control scheme to it. It's got a very clean, modern Autodesk and current programs kind of sort of feel to it as far as the interface is designed. And it's also got a very clean Photoshop-esque layering system. So for sculpting, you can create a base layer, and then you can create a detail layer, and then erase that layer, and it works like Photoshop in that the layer will be erased, but everything underneath won't. You can blend layers together. It's very, very, very nice, but it doesn't have all of those innovative, really awesome features that make ZBrush just really shine as like the top sculpting app in the industry. But it's got really, really nice paint features that ZBrush didn't have. ZBrush had layers, then I would be in ZBrush, and if this had Dynamesh, then I'd probably be in here. And if it had things like Z-Remesher and other really cool stuff that ZBrush has, I'd probably be more in Mudbox. But they both have their own unique strengths and weaknesses. So under our paint layers, what we can do is we can create what we can do first is go into our object list actually, and go to our landscape. And right now it's using that default Maya material that came with it, but we can go ahead and create a new material. I'm going to go ahead and assign a Mudbox material. And we need a Mudbox material in order to actually paint in here, because the Mudbox material exposes channels for Mudbox to paint. Now our diffuse, we want to go ahead and pick a nice bright even white, 255, 255, 255. And the reason for this is because we want to have a clean surface that doesn't have any coloration to it to paint on top of. That way our color blends with a neutral white. If we were to paint on the default Mudbox material or paint on the Maya material, we might get a slight discoloration to our materials. We just want to make sure we start out with a nice neutral, clean material. Our specular, we're going to go ahead and make that black. That's going to give us a totally matte material with no specular to it. Our gloss, we can go ahead and tone that down a little bit. I found that zero gloss creates a weird artifact here in Mudbox. The gloss is your weight in Arnold, so you would plug that into your specular weight, and it controls how shiny the specular that you paint is. We probably won't be painting that here in Mudbox, but it is an option if you need that control over your specular. I personally like using the slider in Arnold to control the weight of my specular. We can paint opacity into our materials here, and we can also paint incandescence, which is similar to emission or similar to luminance if you're familiar with Cinema 4D's luminance, or if you're familiar with emission from some other renderers like perhaps Maxwell. You can paint bump maps, obviously, normal maps as well, and we even have vector displacement in our materials that we can paint also. Alright, so we can get close, we can click close, and we can go ahead and go into our layers, and we can create a new layer here. So let's come over here, create a new layer, and we're going to call it base, and Mudbox is going to allow us to choose what channel we want to paint in. And for now we can paint in the diffuse, but we've got all these other extra channels that we can paint in. And the great thing about Mudbox, of course, is it will allow you to see the results as you paint each one of those channels. We can go back to our object list and we can select in the gray space as well, and that's going to go ahead and hide that yellow that lets us know that our object's selected. And we can come in here and we can start to paint. So I mentioned stencils and projection. So with the stencils, you can go ahead and click on this little arrow icon here in the stencils menu, and you can add a stencil. And we've got quite a few stencils here that I've pretty much pulled off the internet. So you can see this kind of sort of menu that I had up in a previous tutorial here, and I moved to another texture, but I believe I used like either this one, or it was one that had like an 1024 by 1024. But yeah, you could download, just type in repeating dirt texture, and you can download, you know, any dirt texture you want and use it, or you create your own in Photoshop or something like that. You can, of course, change your size here so that you can narrow down your textures to something that are a little bit more larger and have a little bit more resolution to them. You can even go larger than and go ahead and use like 2 or 4 megapixels to get like really high resolution detailed textures that you could use for dirt, as we can see here. This one might even be a better dirt texture, perhaps, because of how large it is. I'm going to go ahead and try to download this one. And so this is pretty simple. You can just come over here and you can just drag it right directly into your Windows Explorer, like so. And that's going to give us that texture. Coming into Photoshop, what we can do is we can load this texture in, and we can create a specular texture out of it that we can use for our specular channel later by going ahead and applying a few adjustments. And there's 2 different ways I like to actually do the specular and bump channels for my materials. And this works for human skin. It works for any material basically, for the most part, with a few exceptions of course. But you can either use black and white, and what this is going to give you is this little icon here with the hand and 2 arrows, which is going to allow you to kind of sort of tighten different areas of black and white. And if you're a traditional photographer like me with a DSLR, this is a great way also to kind of sort of get certain areas of a model to kind of sort of become brighter or darker. If you're doing a more black and white aesthetic look, you know, you can lessen or strengthen the grime on a person's forehead, or not really grime, but more like the oil, the shininess, or reduce it, decontrast out your image and different things like that. So that's one way. That's probably the way I'm going to stick with. But the other way I like to do it sometimes, I like to use hue and saturation. You just desaturate the image and there you go. So that's 2 different ways you can black and white this out. You know, and then we can add a contrast curves here, and we can go ahead and tighten the black up, and that's going to reduce our contrast in the shadows and give us a little bit more darkness there. And then here in the highlights we can increase those up, or, you know, decrease them at will, and that's going to give us a much shinier specular, a much more pronounced specular there that we can work with. For a bump map, you might want to tone those back and even them out, just to reduce the bump a little bit, and then you can always control the bump in Arnold with the bump height. But let's go ahead and save this as, and we're going to save it as a JPEG because we don't really need too much of the rich detail from that texture really. And I'm just going to save over this this copy here, and actually let me go ahead and call this Dirt 2K just to give it a different kind of sort of name, and click OK on that. Back here in Mudbox, we could then go ahead and add our stencil, and we can go ahead and grab our seamless dirt texture, which is going to be a 2K texture for us. And we can go ahead and add another stencil and add our specular. And thus we have both of these stencils available to us for projection painting. Now we could add these as stamps as well. So if we come through here, we go ahead and add a stamp. and we can hunt down our texture. So start to type in the names of our directories here, and we can quickly get to where we want to get to as far as our assets. We can go ahead and load in both of these textures and go ahead and save this file out. And there we go. Now I'm going to do a scene save as, just so I can show you where this has been saved at. So I've created a new Mudbox folder, and Mudbox will save it as a mud file. And behind the scenes, Mudbox will create a folder that also has all your textures in it as well. So you could directly actually paint these in Photoshop, and then if you were to reopen up your Mudbox scene, these changes that you made in Photoshop would indeed pop up. I've obviously already done a little bit of painting a couple of times previously. But yeah, we can go ahead and begin here. So I'm going to go to the object list, and I'm going to click on the gray space to deselect this. I'm going to go to my projection brush, and what I actually really want to do is create another new layer, and I'm going to call this dirt detail. And this is actually where I want to paint this detail texture. So we want to zoom in, of course, bearing in mind our resolution is 2K. We want to get a little bit of this detail. We're going to have to get in pretty close to get the detail of this 2K texture. If our texture is 1K, we probably want to get in even closer and kind of sort of paint that 1K detail in there, really close to get a lot of that fine detail in the final render. So with the stencil, we've got a few options here. Mudbox cleverly gives us the lower right hand corner. We can use the S and left mouse button to go ahead and rotate, and I would recommend doing this on a pretty regular basis to get just a variation in your texture. We can use S right to go ahead and scale the stencil up and down as well, and that's going to give us a lot of variation of scale and size. Alright, we can use the B key, which is similar in Maya as well. Holding down the B key and moving the left mouse button, just dragging, is going to go ahead and increase and decrease our size. And the M key, similar in Maya, is going to allow us to increase or decrease our strength of our brush as well. Just moving left and right here, guys, with that. Alright, we can use the Wacom pen, of course, to add some variation. But I'm going to use this texture. I'm going to go to the stencil, and I'm going to select my dirt texture, my 2K one. And it's turned brown now. And I'm going to use this texture as a kind of sort of dirt detail of sorts. And I'm going to go ahead and increase the strength of my brush drastically here. Give myself quite a bit more oomph. I think I'm actually going to go click on the projection and manually bring up my strength to about 100% here. Bring up my brush size using the B key, and I'm just going to go ahead and start to paint that in. And I'm pretty much going to use this as a kind of sort of detail on top of what I'm going to do on my base. So on my base, I'm going to go ahead and turn off this layer using the dots. And that's going to go ahead and turn off the whole entire effect of that layer. And on my base layer, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the paintbrush, and I'm going to set up a stamp image. Now, the stamp that I want to use is going to be that same dirt, a 2K dirt texture. But because we're using a stamp now, we have the ability to randomly rotate, do these two operations. I'm not entirely sure what these two operations do, but this is your scale here. Randomly scale it. You can look these two operations up. I feel like they're like randomly making it go up and down. in different ways, but it could be the scale vertically and horizontally. But with that set up and with the strength set up to a pretty fair value here, we can go ahead with our Wacom pen and we can start to paint in some variation here. Now we're using a stencil, and so in projection brush, the stencil acts as just a paint through. But here in regular paintbrush, it acts more like a detail brush, which is fun in and of itself. But we don't really need that brush, that detail brush, so we're going to go ahead and turn that off. And now I can just paint in a variation of my dirt pattern through here, and I can get all that randomness that you would have to get manually through the stencil. You can just get that automatically here through the paintbrush and using a stamp, which is really great. Now, my strength isn't at 100%, and I really like to build up my values, kind of like a traditional artist, you know, just on paper, kind of sort of just stroking in this color and building it up on top of the base white color here. I feel like it gives me a much more organic texture to do it that way. And oftentimes I only really use my Wacom pen when I'm painting like this. But as you can see, unlike with the Cinema 4D version of the model, the FBX file, we're getting a much tighter, we're getting a nice smooth paint here, thanks to using a model that had the shells kind of sort of all together. Alright, you can just slowly paint this in and get some of this detail going here. Alright, and then, you know, we'll hit save every now and again to make sure everything gets nice and saved. Because especially on my computer, I'm running a GeForce 550 Ti, but I've always had issues with this video card ever since I first got it, and whenever I'm doing something that has really intense texture workflows or really intense OpenGL kind of sort of stuff like Mudbox or Mari or something like that, my video card will oftentimes crash. I really need to go and get into like buying a new video card at some point very soon. But as you can see here in your UV view, you can start to see how your texture is starting to come together now. Different areas are starting to fill out here. And so that's a good view. If you want to paint this flat, you can't just paint directly on the 2D texture like you can in body paint or in Mari. What you would need to do is go to UV and maps, and you can actually flatten this to UV space. And then what'll happen is you'll actually get cards here in your 3D view, and you can actually then paint this, which is actually kind of cool. Actually, it's a 3D 2D view of sorts, so you can, you know, come here off a glancing side or whatever and paint. But you can paint in 2 dimensions here, and then when you're ready, you can go back into 3 dimensions, unflatten from UV space, and then come back in here and continue painting if you want to go into 2D like that. So I'm gonna go ahead and meet you guys back on the other side once I'm done getting this base color set in. And so I'm saving now. Yeah, I'm just gonna go ahead and save our textures, and you want to save pretty regularly here in Mudbox. With a painting program like this, you can quickly get into a situation where you just kind of sort of get into your painting, and you just forget to save, and you know, it could just get real bad for you real quick. You might paint like over half of the texture, might even paint some stuff on another map, and then you just lose all of that. Especially with the way my video card is. But I've created a secondary layer here. I haven't gotten to the dirt detail yet, but I've created this dirt crack layer, and I just basically loaded in another stamp from another texture I downloaded off the internet here. It's more of a crackly kind of sort of texture. We can go to our stencils and load that up as well as a stencil. And then if I were to go ahead and select that stencil, you can see how that kind of sort of looks. So it's got more of a crackly type texture to it. And you know, it's just going to give us a little bit of extra detail on top of our base layer here, our kind of sort of base coat that we got going. Every now and again, you're going to notice the artifacting lines here as Mudbox kind of sort of updates itself. You won't see that in your final renderer, of course. Mudbox is pretty good about allowing you to be able to paint over seams and different things like that. But let's go into our paintbrush. Let's go ahead and turn off our stencil. And in stamp here, with the paintbrush, we're going to go ahead and use this as a stamp, and then we're going to kind of paint that detail into here. And what we can do with this layer is we can start to play around with our blending modes. So we have all of our common Photoshop blending modes here. I'm going to go with overlay, which is going to give us kind of like a 50% gray combination of the two layers. It's going to give us some really nice rusty highlights on the dirt, and then we can of course lower the layer opacity, and that's just going to give us some nice variation there. Multiply will make things darker, so you can get some burn effects there. Or screen will make things lighter. You can get a dodge kind of sort of going with that. Overlay is going to be very, very good for getting a contrast to things. Soft light's going to be a little bit softer. I think I might use soft light and increase the distribution there a little bit. And then I'm going to go ahead and paint this kind of sort of over here in general. And just give this a little bit more breakup and variation here across the map. And I am painting over multiple UV tiles here, so with it zoomed out like this, I definitely want to make sure that I save on a semi-regular basis. Just to kind of, since a lot of tiles are getting updated, that's a lot of memory being consumed. And just go ahead and paint some of that variation in. Maybe, you know, in some areas, maybe paint a little bit more of that. Give ourselves a little bit of a difference here. Maybe in some areas you might even want to use the stencil to go ahead and you know, really pronounce that cracking. I'm going to use S right click to go ahead and zoom that stencil in, and then you know, I can come into some areas and I can start to paint this detail in. Use B to bring my brush size down, and you know, I can start to kind of paint that in much more harshly here, but you know, allow myself to use the stencil to go ahead and paint it in a way that's going to make it look a little bit more crackly and organic rather than looking randomly distributed like the stamp is going to give me. So that's painting into there, getting that detail coming through. And you know, so just vary it up. It's all about really having fun and just being very random with what you're doing. But all right, the dirt detail, what I want to do with this layer is I want to use the stencil and the projection brush to go ahead and actually paint the detail of this dirt directly into the to the texture. Because this is 2K, we technically could actually zoom out here and just paint each individual tile at about this level here. I'm gonna go ahead and use the brush, bring the size down just a wee bit, and go ahead and start to paint this dirt detail in there. And okay, the layer is not turned on right now, so I'm make sure we turn on the layer. And, I just want to add this dirt detail in here and have it directly be in here. And C, S, left mouse button is working really great. We'll put my Wacom pin. So I'm just going to do that. And, you just want to vary these up, rotating them in different directions, and, build this texture up. And then we can use another blending mode or some opacity tricks to go ahead and kind of sort of tone that down. Play around with different blending modes here. Dissolve actually looks really amazing. And I very rarely ever use Dissolve in my work, but that actually probably looked like one of the best modes for this texture. I'm not trying to have it overpower the base layer too much. Overlay is fun if we want to add some more contrast into this. Hard light could be nice too, with a little bit less opacity on it, of course. But I think I'm going to go with Dissolve. I really like the way Dissolve kind of sort of breaks that layer up, but gives us this really nice look. And go ahead and continue to use the Wacom pen and just kind of sort of build this texture up. And Alt left. Okay, Alt and Wacom is not really working all too well for me. So I'm gonna use the mouse to go ahead and pan around and get back into painting here. And I might paint a secondary coat here on the same layer of that crack texture to kind of sort of give a variation. Some of the texture having some sort of jagginess to it. If you want to paint this a little bit faster and you don't want to deal too much with the variation yourself, just kind of go a little bit faster, you can, under the stencils, go ahead and select the picture and then go ahead and say use tiles. And we're going to go ahead and save. And what this will do is, of course, it'll bring up this whole tiled kind of sort of deal. And you can come in a little bit closer to get more detail in there. And you can just start to paint away. And you can just really quickly build this up. And if you've got a repeating texture like we do, that's going to look pretty good for the most part. You're not going to really have to do too much to make that work. And so with a combination of textures, blending modes, opacities, and different things like that, you could get away with a technique like this and still have it look very variable. And it's mostly because you're just not using just one asset. And that's kind of the big thing. You want to combine assets together. Using one asset, okay, people are going to look at that and be like, yeah, it's pretty basic. That's cartoony, that's gamey. As you start to add more and more assets into this, it starts to take on its own unique character and add your own unique artistic flair to it. And you can't tell the constituent components anymore. And you take care of kind of sort of that plagiarism kind of sort of issue you might have, and you also take care of a uniqueness standpoint of your artwork. Your artwork begins to look like its own. It doesn't look like somebody else's hard work. All right, we've almost got this. So what we're gonna do now is I'm just gonna take a few more moments to go ahead and paint out the rest of this and get this how I wanna look. And then we're gonna look at specular next. So see you guys there. Alrighty guys, and I'm back. And so I've painted the last detail texture. I basically created a dirt detail too, and I put that crackly desert-like texture on there. Just used the tile workflow and just painted the texture straight out. And then what I did was I used the paint erase with a stamp image, and I believe I used probably one of the dirt stamp images. And I just went ahead and I just started erasing parts of it and built this up. And then I've changed the blending mode to dissolve, which I'm finding is working pretty well. I kind of like it. This is all live. We can change all of this, which is really good. But let's go ahead and click the new layer plus sign here. And let's go ahead and create a specular channel and call that base spec. And I'd like to call it base, but you can't have layers that have the same name here in Mudbox. So I'm just going to call that base spec to give it some difference there. And now we've got a specular channel. And so this channel will probably go a little bit faster. We can basically come in with any of our textures, and right now we only have really one dirt texture here that we have a stencil for. So come in here into our projection, and we can just start to kind of sort of paint this in and get a level of detail going here. So as we start to paint this in, you can see that Mudbox is giving us all of that specular detail right away in the viewport. And so all of that is shining right through, and we're able to see immediately how our specular looks, which is really great. We can go ahead and of course add some variation to this specular once we've painted it down. So once again, I'm just using the paint, the projection brush with a tileable stencil here, and I'm just going to go ahead and just paint this in and save every 30 seconds or so, just to make sure nothing crazy is going down. And just to prevent a little bit of stretching in different areas, I noticed some stretching with my textures in the diffuse map, and so on certain areas where it had stretched, I just came right back through and used used a different view and just repainted over it to kind of get a better look. Alright, and so we can hit Q, go ahead and hide our stencil, and we can see how our specular kind of sort of looks. And right now it's looking a little hot for my taste, so we can either tone down the base specular level here, or we can come in and start to erase a little bit of that specular. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and keep that the way it is, but I'm going to go in and start to tone down some of this with a paint erase. And I'm going to use my desert stencil here. Actually, I'm not going to use the stencil. I'm going to use the stamp. I'm going to use my desert stamp here. And I'm just going to come in and with the paint erase and a very, very, very low strength. I think 31 is pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and start to erase certain areas and just kind of sort of break up this specular a little bit and make this look a little bit more like dirt again. Just keep that specular from getting way too hot in certain areas. This is kind of course, similar to the technique that I used for that last dirt detail texture. You know, once I had painted in the coat, I just went in real quick, just started to erase certain areas to give myself a little bit of room to breathe in my texture, nothing that's too overpowering. And it's funny because I was actually really liking the matte look, but yeah, we do need just a tiny bit of specularity in this for this particular scene. Obviously, for other characters, you know, you might want more of that shininess involved. But this is pretty much a dirt mountain, like a hill of sorts, and so specular doesn't need to be terribly strong for this. You know, just enough that you can see some variation, some hot spots. As we get closer in on the texture, of course, you know, that detail starts to shine through thanks to our 2K maps and thanks to our breaking up everything into multiple tiles. So up close, this stuff looks really good, as you can see. And so that kind of takes care of our specular map for the most part. And that's pretty much it for the Mudbox painting. We could go into a lot more detail, and behind the scenes I'll probably go in, probably make this look a little bit better, but in our next tutorial we are going to cover this up with a lot of trees and a lot of stuff, a lot of growth. So what we can do now is we can go ahead and save our scene one more time just to be on the safe side, and then what we can do is we can go to File here and go to Export All Paint Layers. And what we're going to do is, by default, this usually has these unchecked, these merge channels here. What we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and merge all the diffuse channels together and all the specular channels together. And that way we'll get just a single map with diffuse and specular. For our channel, we can go ahead and call this, let's do a WinKey E here. And go into our documents, go into Testa here, and see what we named our original assets here. I want to keep our naming convention, so it's going to be landscape. And diffuse. And then here, we're going to do landscape and specular. Alrighty. And we'll just do underscores on the ends of those. Here for the file type, we can use the layers default type, which in our particular case I believe is TIFF, or we can actually just specify it directly, just to avoid any trouble. I'm going to go ahead and specify that as 8-bit RGBA, and I'm going to go ahead and export this out. And so the files got exported. I did want to make mention of one more thing in that export dialog before we move on, guys. Your path is right here, so you probably want to definitely specify your path before you actually hit the export button. Luckily, I had already specified my path previously, another time when I tried to export these out, and I've exported out to the Mudbox folder, so I could go ahead and do any renaming I needed to do there before I send this over to the C4D text folder. Alright. And so now those files are exported, and I've actually moved them over to a export folder here in the Arnold Landscape folder, just so I could run a quick script. So these files have the naming convention of Mudbox right now, and I've been testing the Arnold tile token, and it hasn't been quite working for me. And honestly, I prefer Mari's UDIM naming convention anyway. That's a little bit easier to work with in a number of different applications. So here on the web, I was doing some research, and I came across this website, and you guys could pause the video if you want to go ahead and grab this link. I'll also probably include it in the description. But this guy went ahead and created a script. I was actually looking into creating my own script, but luckily I came across this, and I don't have to go through too much of that hassle trying to actually create my own script and figure out how to package it up for you guys. It's going to require Python, of course. I'm not going to really go into how you install Python in this particular tutorial series. But what I will do is I'll show you how you can run this script. So assuming you have Python on your path like I do, you can come in and just go ahead and do a change directory here, and then you can go into your Arnold landscape folder, go into the export folder, grab that link there. Actually, we're going to do a H colon here. That's going to take us to our H drive. Go ahead and paste our path there and do a change directory command to go in there. And then we can go ahead and run our Python script. So I've stored it in my Python directory. It's installed with Python, and just go ahead and drag that in there. And then we can go ahead and follow his instructions. And he says that we just need to do attack I for our input and attack O for our output. We just specify the names of whatever programs we want to switch between. So it'll be I Mudbox. Mudbox to attack O Mari. And then we're using TIFFs, so we're going to just do a multiplication TIFF here. And that should go through and rename everything. Should give us some output if it's working correctly, and it's saying that it's renaming all that stuff. That's really great. And we're set to go. Alrighty, so coming back over here, everything should be nicely renamed for us. Like so. And we can go ahead and drag those over to our C4D texture folder. And I think I accidentally might have quickly hit something and copied those right directly in their same folder, which is kind of crazy. Alright, let's do a Control A here, and then let's drag and drop these into the texture folder. Excellent. So back here in Cinema, we can go ahead and open up our landscape material. And what we want to do is just go ahead and duplicate one of these image nodes. And because our naming convention is still landscape, we just go ahead and add that diff to the end of that. Drag this image node over here to the blue icon here and plug it into the surface, the standard shaders color diffuse. And then let's drag out another one. Drag this over to the specular color. Once again, if you're using gloss, you're going to want to pop that into the weight. And then this won't be diffuse, this will be spec. And assuming no errors, we should happily see our landscape update with our nice textures. And here we go, guys. And so I just ran into just a few issues, mostly corruption of textures, mostly. I mean, I'm talking about 18 tiles here, so, you know, depending upon maybe the state of your computer, depending upon, you know, how finicky Mudbox is being, like, you know, at any particular time, you know, it's possible one of those textures could get messed up in translation or something like that. Just re-export out, replace the ones that are kind of messed up, and you'll be good to go. All right, so as we zoom out, we can see for a second there, as Arnold kind of sort of refreshes, we get kind of sort of a tiling there. And that's just mainly an artifact in the IPR, I'd imagine. It won't affect your actual final renders as the camera moves through the scene. The only other thing we need to do here is just make sure that our specular is enabled. So come over here to our standard shader and just want to add some weight here to bring our specular into play, and you see how we're starting to get some really nice shine there from our specular. It's giving us a little bit more oomph to our landscape. And we can go ahead and increase our roughness, of course, because this is dirt, so it's going to be more along the lines of a diffuse specular there. And of course we can add some Fresnel, and we're going to get our nice dirt mound look back with some really nice specularity. And so that is pretty much that. So in the next tutorial, I'll go over a few more things I missed out here on this one. This one's running a little long. Just a little bit of how you can go into Photoshop and paint things and bring it back into Mudbox. And then what we'll really discuss in our next tutorial is going to be speed tree, and how we can take some trees and use the Arnold scene source files or AS files to go ahead and use a cloner to clone a whole bunch of procedural stuff in here and get really fast feedback in Cinema 4D, but have a huge amount of geometry in Arnold. And this is some of the stuff that Arnold really excels at. Millions and millions of polygons in render while still allowing you to get really fast feedback in your DCC of choice, or your digital content creation application of choice. So I'll see you guys there.